What's going on, everybody? It's Patrick from Purple Park Studios, and today I want to talk about creating awesome environments and getting a nice render in Blender. So we're going to talk about this photo here first. So before we even jump into Blender, I just want to point out a couple things with the compositing. You might have heard people talk about guiding lines or pointing lines in composition. So if you look right here and right here, these lines are directing the eye towards the center of the image. And then here is a circle, and shapes are very attractive to the human eye. So I have these guiding lines pointing in here, and then there's a big circle, a shape of that, or it's like a half circle kind of being consumed by the flame. And then there's a triangle in the middle, and this circle and triangle with the fire, that's the whole center point. There should be a focal point that is clear and easy to identify. There's also some depth of field. So jumping into Blender, this is what the actual setup is like, what it looks like here. And if we go ahead into Look Dev mode, you'll see that what's going on is I have a huge plane here for the wall for the backdrop. And then I have some image textures, or they're actually video files. So we can go to the shading tab. I've got some video files here that I've offset the start time to a position that I liked, and you can change the offset here. And essentially, I've scattered these video files around the scene. I got these off of a site called Pexels, so you can just search for, fire or anything that you'd like, and there's images and videos. It's a great website. So real quick, I just want to touch on this circle here. This is just a regular circle, and what I did was, if I go into my shading tab here, for the texture of this circle, I used the video file as well, and then I just went into my UV tab, and I just mapped this circle, the UVs, to a point that I liked, so it kind of gives it this look like, it's being consumed, some parts of the circle are burnt off, and I just thought it was a really cool effect. So I do want to real quick talk about some things I did in the render settings and a couple of things I did with the camera settings. With the camera settings, it's nothing too crazy. I have some depth of field. I got my f-stop cranked pretty low at 0.2, and then the focus distance is set so that this is the main focus of the picture. I also changed it from perspective to panoramic, which just warps the image slightly, but you can't really notice much of a difference. Another thing I like to do is have this Passe Partout on. It just makes it a little easier when using the camera and focusing in. That way you're not distracted by all this other stuff and you know exactly what you're seeing. Under the output properties, I did change the resolution to 2160 by 2160, so it's like the square version of 4K, and it just renders out at a lot high quality, but you could also do 1080 by 1080 if you wanted to have the square. And I do the square because I do a lot of stuff with like album art for like bands and artists, so rendering out in a square works great when uploading to like Spotify and Apple Music. Going up to the render properties, I am using Eevee. I changed the sampling for the render to 128. I just think it looks a little bit nicer. That's also what I typically use in cycles. Other than that, I just have the bloom, screen space reflections, and motion blur on, and that's because I was messing with a particle system. So if I go forward, you'll see that there's some particles, which I ended up not using that in the final render, but it is there. And then lastly, down here, I have it on Filmic, but the look I changed to a medium high contrast, and you could also play with like high contrast or very high contrast, but I like to leave it at the medium high because a lot of times I'll take my renders and put them into Lightroom and make a couple edits and changes with the color and the lighting in there, and it's just a little bit easier so I don't end up rendering out an image with too much information and then it's a little bit hard to manipulate it in Lightroom. I'd rather go with, the Filmic, the less contrasted look, so I can always add that contrast later if I choose to do so. That's pretty much it. I do have 4 point lights scattered around the scene just to add lighting in a couple different places. So when looking through the camera, it just adds, I'm just basically mimicking the light of this fire that's down here. So the next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about this render here, which is kind of similar in style, if you will. Obviously different color scheme, completely different environment. So once again, you'll notice these guiding lines, kind of the sides here. There's some plants and shrubs that I have here on the side, just kind of helping to guide the eye. Again, I have rocks and then again stairs leading up, which this is kind of the center point right here, this big cube. And then once again, there's some shapes. We have the long rectangles from these pillars. We have the half circle here and then a full circle here. So lots of shapes just to kind of catch that eye. And then again, those pointing lines along the sides kind of leading everything up to here. I do have this skeleton guy here in the rule of thirds, and if you're not sure what that is, there's a lot of great things online. You could look that up. And then essentially, of course, this line here is leading from the skeleton to the cube. So here I am in Blender for this session. I'm going to hop out of the camera mode. So this is basically the set here. Let me just extend this. So the set here, I've got a big plane essentially, and then just I've modeled a couple little things in the scene. The bushes are in image textures off of 3dtextures.com. The rocks and the skeleton are from BlenderKit, but everything else in the scene I modeled. Nothing crazy, just a couple little simple objects that I textured. So this is a material preview of it right here. So just real quick to touch back on a rule of thirds. So you can see here I have these lines looking through the camera view, and if I go to my camera and I select my camera down here, and I go down to composition guides, it should be closed, but you can open it up like that, composition guides. You can check center and thirds, but for this situation, I just have thirds on. So the rule of thirds is basically, if you place an object at one of these points here in your scene, you can see there's these 4 little points, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just a guide to helping compose a nice image. This line going across the bottom here, I'm not sure if you can see it, it's a very thin line. That I have lined up with the top of my stairs and the platform here, just so it's also another guide in composing the image nicely. And then again, everything else is roughly centered in the image, right up about in this area, and it's just guides for composing, as to where things should go when composing your shot. So it can be very helpful. You don't always have to follow it, but I've found that recently it's really helped me get nicer renders. So once again, we'll take a look at what I did with the camera and the render settings. In the render properties, again, ambient occlusion, bloom, and screen space reflections, I am using Eevee, and I do have my render sampling set to 128. Again, filmic, medium, high contrast, and you can use the curves, which I was messing with a little bit, but I decided to just leave the curves off and do any extra edits in Lightroom just to keep things simple. As far as my camera settings, I have it set to 24 millimeters, which I believe the other image was also set to 24 millimeters. And I just want to point out that if I go out here and you take a look at where my camera is, it's pretty close to the ground, about where like somebody would be standing, and it's pointing up a bit just to kind of give it the feeling that this is a very big deal, like this is something really great. You're almost like looking up at it. So it just helps to make this whole scene feel a little bit bigger, and a lot of times where you place the camera can really affect how your shot feels. So if you just imagine the skeleton guy standing here, say you or another skeleton or something was standing where the camera is, that would be their view. And then again, the f-stop is set to 1.8, and the focus distance this time is set on the cube, which you can use the little eyedropper tool and select anything that you'd like. But in this situation, I have it set to focus on the cube. Other than that, there's nothing really crazy going on. So a lot of it's just camera position and finding those guides and knowing where to place objects in your scene to get the right composition. And don't forget those lines. You don't always have to use lines along the side. There's lots of other ways you can guide the eye to the center point of your image, which doesn't always have to be in the center, but it should usually be in the center or at one of these points for the rule of thirds. So guys, thanks for watching, and I hope this tutorial was helpful. If you found it helpful, don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment, and hit subscribe. And let me know if anyone's interested in me doing a tutorial where maybe I build an environment from scratch and we go through every single process of what I do, from the modeling or any assets that I might use all the way up to lighting and rendering. So if there's any interest in that, just let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.